hello everyone. How are you all doing? I hope everything is okay. I hope you're safe. Um, I really missed all of you, and unfortunately, as you know, we can't continue our classes in the school because of the circumstances that we're going through. Anyway, that can never stop us from completing our English course. Today, we are going to continue working on our writing skill. If you remember, we talked before about writing opinion essays and the parts of opinion essays, and we practiced that a few times. Today we will start talking about the other type of writing that you might have in the final exam, which is the informative writing. What do you mean by informative writing? As the title suggests here, you can see that we are going to focus on stories. So whenever you see the word narrative, we are basically talking about writing stories. What is a narrative? Now let's take a look at the definition of a narrative. Now a narrative is a term more commonly known as story. Narratives written for college or personal narratives tell a story, usually to some point, to illustrate some truth or insight. Now, when we write a story, we want just to make some kind of statement. We want to illustrate a truth that we believe in or an idea that we believe in. We do that while we are telling the story. Following are some tools to help you structure your personal narrative, breaking it down into parts. Now, let's break down writing narratives or the parts of any interesting story into its basic parts. Now, the first part, of course, is going to be the introduction. And as you can see in the introduction, we basically have three main parts. That's going to be my first paragraph of the story that I'm going to write in the final exam. Now, the first part of this paragraph, remember, so the introduction is going to be the first paragraph. Now, the first part of this paragraph is something we call it the hook. Now, what do we mean by the hook? Start your paper with a statement about your story that catches the reader attention. Now this is very important. For example, a relevant quotation, question, fact, or definition. Now, to have the attention of the reader so that he can continue reading your story without feeling bored or without just throwing it away without completing it, is to start with a very interesting sentence. Try to remember movies. Now, sometimes you watch a movie and right from the beginning you feel that they started the movie right from the middle. So they just put you in the middle of the story immediately, and later on the events and the actions will unfold and you will understand what happened before and you will get to know what is going to happen later. Now you can follow the same approach when you write your story. The first sentence should be as interesting as possible, as exciting as possible. You can start your story or this first sentence from the middle of the story, and later you can go back to the beginning to make it to make the reader understand all of the details. Now, next we have set the scene. We need to prepare the reader. We need to give him some information. Now, we need to give him some information about what? Let's see. Provide the information the reader will need to understand the story. Who are the major characters? When and where is it taking place? Is it a story about something that happened to you, to the writer, or is it fiction? So when you write the introduction, you start with the first part that we talked about, which is the hook. Now the next part, you try to give the reader some information about the people in the story, about the place, about the time of the story. All of these things are things, or all of these elements are elements that the reader is going to need while reading so that he can fully understand the story that you are going to write. The next part of the introduction is going to be the thesis statement. That's the last part of the first paragraph, the paragraph of the introduction. Now, what is the thesis statement? The thesis of a narrative essay plays a slightly different role than that of an argument or expository essay. Now, a narrative thesis can begin the events of the story. For example, it was sunny and warm out when I started down the path. Now, also, it offers a moral or a lesson learned. For example, I'll never hike alone again, or identify a theme that connects the story to a universal experience. For example, journeys bring both joy and hardship. You can choose any of these three kinds of thesis, and you can write them as the last sentence of your introduction. So again, you can see that most of the elements of the introduction are elements that are going to raise the curiosity of the reader, so that he's eager to know what's going to happen next in your story. And in that way, you can make your story as interesting as possible, and you can make the beginning, the introduction, as inviting as possible to the reader. Now, let's move to the next part. The next part, of course, is going to be the body paragraph or paragraphs of my story. Now, you can write two paragraphs at least here. Try not to write only one paragraph, so that you are going to have the total as 4 paragraphs at least, not 3. Okay, so you can have the total paragraphs of your full essay, including the introduction and the conclusion, something like 4 paragraphs at least, or maybe 5, but 4 is okay. Now let's see the parts of the body paragraphs. Now the first thing that we need to know is that we need to show, and we are not only telling. What do we mean by that? It means that a good storytelling includes details and descriptions. Now when you write your story, try to always use adjectives to describe things. Like you're talking about a man, you can just say, I met a man in the street, and you can say, I met a tall man who was wearing a blue jacket, and his face, for example, was really pale. He looked really tired, and he was asking me for help. You see, now here I'm giving details, and I'm describing how the man looked at that moment, instead of just saying, I met a man in the street and he asked me for help. Now this will help the reader to understand the experience that the writer was going through. Now think about using all the 5 senses. Also, to remember to describe in your story, you need to remember to use the 5 senses. Not only the sense of sight, to add details about what you heard. You can add details about what you saw, what you felt during the event. For example, my heart jumped as the dark shape of the brown grizzly lurched toward me out of the woods. Now this provides more information about what the writer saw and felt than just saying, I saw a bear when I was hiking. Now of course the first sentence is more interesting than this sentence, and it gives more details and more descriptions than this very simple sentence. Now the next part, or the next thing that we should include in all of our body paragraphs, we need to include some kind of supporting evidence. What do we mean by that? In a personal narrative, your experience acts as the evidence that proves your thesis. The events of the story should demonstrate the lesson learned or the significance of the event to you. Now when I write my story, now my experience will prove the evidence for the thesis that I provided in the introduction. Now all of the events in the story should show the lesson, or should support the lesson that I learned at the end of the story, and this is something we are going to talk about in the conclusion in a few minutes. Now the third part of any body paragraph, remember here all of these 3 should be available in any body paragraph. Now in any body paragraph we should use some words to show the passage of time, to show that time was passing while this story was happening. Now remember, the story has a beginning, has a middle, has an end. Now it started at a particular time and it continued over a duration of time, and of course going to end after some time. Now I need to show the reader that there is some time that's passing while he is reading. So writing about the events of your experience using time chronologically. Now chronologically means showing the time from the beginning until the end, from A to Z. Now from the beginning to end is the most common and clear way to tell a story. Now whether you choose to write chronologically or not, use transition words to clearly indicate the reader what happened first, next, and last. Sometimes transitions are words like what? Words like next, finally, during, after, when, later, then, afterwards, after a few moments, in the morning, in the evening, any words that will show that time is passing while the actions or the events of the story are taking place. Now, the next part, of course, is going to be the conclusion. Now, the conclusion is going to be the last paragraph of our narrative essay. Now, of course, it should provide the moral of the story. Now, what do we mean by the moral of the story? Let's see. Now, the conclusion of a narrative includes the closing of action of the event, but also should include some reflection or analysis of the significance of the event to the writer. What does that mean? It means, what lesson did you learn? How has what happened to you affected your life now? Now, this story happened to you, or it happened to a person that you know. Now, after after you had this experience, what did you learn from this experience? What did you learn from this story? Now, is your life now, after all of what happened in this story, the same as your life before? Did your life change? Did it help you for the better? Did it help you change to the worse? All of these things should be included in the conclusion. So remember, in the conclusion, you need to tell us the moral of the story, or the lesson that you have learned from this story. Now, in any story, just to try to imagine the events of the story, now we have something called the narrative graph. Now, what do I mean by the narrative graph? Now, in any and also I think that you remember this a little bit from our work on literature in the first semester. Now, in any story, we always start with something we call the starting action, or the rising action, if you remember from the first semester. Now, after that, we reach something we call it the middle action, or also, if you remember from the first semester in literature, we call this the crisis, and after which is the highest point of tension. And after that, we have the end action, along which we have the falling action. So remember, we have the rising action, we have the crisis, and we have the falling action and the end action. Now, these elements should be in mind anytime you are writing a narrative or a story. Let's take a look at the sample introduction. Now, here we have somebody saying, when I was 10 years old, I almost died in the kitchen. Now, what do you think this sentence is? Now, of course, this sentence is the hook. Now, this is the beginning of the story. This is the first sentence of the story, and it's interesting. It almost starts from the middle of the story. You can see that he's saying, when I was 10 years old, I almost died in the kitchen. Now, as a reader, you will ask yourself, what happened? Why did he almost die in the kitchen? Now, let me continue reading so that I can get to know more about it. Now, one day I was the only one home because my parents went to an elementary school to teach, and my big sister was staying at her friend's house. I was bored, and I played video games a whole lot. In the early evening, I became hungry, but there was nothing to eat. I looked in our refrigerator, but there was only some vegetables and medium spicy curry raw. When I saw that, I thought my mother can make curry easily, so I can make curry too. I decided to make curry by myself, but it would be dangerous because I had never cooked anything until then. Now, what do you think the information here in the middle is? Now, of course, here we are setting the scene. We are preparing the reader. We are giving him some information about the sister, the mother, the people in the family, and of course, the last part here is the thesis. It's where he decided to do something dangerous. Now, let's take a look at the sample body paragraph. Now, a sample body paragraph, as you can see, it has words like at first, second, after, next, before. All of these words are the chronological time references. These words will show that time is passing, and they will help the reader to feel the passage of time while he's reading. Now, in your story, you should use some of these words to achieve that. For example, at first I started to cook some rice, second I cut onions, after I stopped crying, next I peeled potatoes, before I fried them I forgot to grease the bottom, etc., etc. So this is a sample body paragraph. Now, now let's take a look at a sample narrative conclusion, or a sample conclusion of our story. How can I conclude? For example, these days I often cook curry and rice by myself. Now that I know how to make it properly, I have become much better at it. I think it is good for us to try new things. Even if we are not perfect at first, we can become better and better. Now, this is, what do you think? This is the moral of the story. This is the lesson that he has learned, or she has learned from the story. Now, they learned that it's okay to try new things, even if we have a problem in the beginning. Anyway, after trying and trying, we can be better and we can improve. This is a perfect example of a moral of the story, or the lesson that we have learned from this story. Now, there is homework, of course. That homework is going to be posted to you, as I told you in the beginning of this video. It's going to be sent to you in PDF file as a writing assignment. Please try to read it carefully and do the task and send it to me as soon as possible, so that I can check it and I can give you some supporting feedback. Thank you for watching. I wish you good luck in all of your studies, and I'll be talking to you soon later. Goodbye.